YOLO, composing gloves here. So a guy asked me on Facebook if I could try and make this sound with something that is stock NFL. And I was like, sure, why not? This is what I came up with. This is the original. And this one is mine. So, it's always not going to be quite there, but I got far enough to where I was like, okay, I've had an enjoyable experience making this. Now let me share with you some of the things I learned on this journey, as well as some things you can use to make this sound for yourself. I spent a solid hour trying out different methods. I was really tempted to reach for something like Synth 1 just because it sounds like something that would be made in Synth 1. It's got similar effects already on, and Synth 1 touts analog oscillators, so that seemed like something that would actually fit really well in this particular case. But they wanted to do it with some FL stuff, so I was like, all right, I'll use Citrus in this case. So I found the following process to work. I would get a saw wave, automate its volume with an envelope, automate its pitch with an envelope, automate a filter with an envelope, add some reverb. At this point, we're a lot closer to the general shape of the sound, but it's not quite there. We're missing the timbre. And this is when we find that the low end of the sound is timbrally different than the high end. It just means the timbre of the low end just doesn't sound the same as the timbre of the high end. If you're playing a higher note, it's going to sound different. So that means that something in the signal chain is causing a different behavior when high notes are played rather than playing low notes. So I reached for distortion. This is something that typically behaves like this. The distortion will change the high end differently than it will the low end. And I actually went for 2 levels of this in order to get the sound the way it is. Now this isn't something in the process that occurred to me for a while. I was originally going at it completely with just filters. And the distortion actually ended up being pretty important. So these steps in general got me to the sound I'm at. There are more steps, there's more details, there's EQs that I touched and didn't touch, and I'm gonna toss out all the stuff that sort of didn't work unless I thought it was important, and just share with you the thought process and some of the things you can try out so you can improve in your efforts. Maybe you'll make a much better sound or a much closer sound than mine. Who knows? So on my first hearing, I had no doubt that it must be some kind of saw wave. I also heard a bunch of reverb and some delay or chorus or something like that. And if there was a chorus, it had to be subtle because there was no clear phasing that was audible. So if there was something like a delay, it was a sort of a mask delay, but it sounded like something that was producing a stereo image. I also knew that there had to be a filter because no unfiltered saw wave sounds like what we're hearing. It just doesn't sound like that. I also noticed that the pitch was just not sitting still. It seemed to be moving up to the note, but at the time I wasn't really quite sure what the pitch was doing because it was just sort of a funny thing, but I noticed something about the pitch. On top of all this, I heard some pretty severe changes in the timbre compared from low notes to high notes like we previously stated, and this is going to present a challenge. Whenever something does this, if you don't nail the process, it becomes quite hard to replicate if you're just going to try and brute force it. So when I heard this sound, all these things went through my head, and this was my starting point. This was like, these were the things I needed to check off and experiment and see what I could do to get closer from there. And you should notice that distortion is not on my list yet. That's because I thought it was all about filtering and post-automation. but it does sound like the sound is being triggered by some sort of an envelope, so automation sounded more like a brute force method, and that was the way I was sort of thinking at the moment. I mean, it's like, well, maybe it was all filtering, I don't know, but I came a lot closer with distortion, so I think some distortion was involved, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe I went down a totally different path than the original creator. So I settled on Citrus just because it has extensive controls. There's just lots of things I can reach out and touch and manipulate. If I need to get specific, I can. And when you're replicating, if you don't get the process down, the ability to get specific is pretty valuable. It's also very easy to work with waveforms. And what I mean by this is in Citrus, I can play a saw wave, or I can morph a teeny bit into a triangle wave, which can sometimes make a world of difference. There are other tools that could do stuff similar to this, like wavetable synthesis, but Citrus can do it just fine, and so I picked it because I wanted the waveform morpher. So now I've got my saw wave, but it's not necessarily set in stone at this point. I'm still open to changing the waveform to whatever I think I will need or whatever offers more insight into the process. So I just think it's a saw wave at this point. I find myself asking the question, what moves would get me closest to the original sound the fastest? Usually contour makes a pretty big dent in my experience, and also I find it helpful to make a little backing track, which is why there's a little track to sort of get the same ambiance. So I can sort of replicate mixing and things of that nature. It'll often help me get a lot more close. It's like I'm channeling the same creativity, or if you want to call it that, or at least at the very least, I can just make a decent sound if I have a really hard time getting close to the original. So going for contour first, just because I want to get there closer, faster, I go for the pitch bend, because the pitch bend seems like a pretty integral part of the sound. For this, I use an envelope because the sound re-triggers the same way every time. It sounds very analog. I think this was made using an analog synth. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one of you knows what the sound was made with. But it sounds like the notes are settling down after a period of pitch bend, but they're even still a little unstable after settling, which again is sort of a clue to me that maybe this is an analog thing. I tried out both up and down pitch bends, and I find that pitch bending up to the note is what I want. Down actually sounded way different than I thought it was gonna sound. Like, it wasn't even close. So it was definitely up was the one I was going for. And I fiddled with the pitch envelope until I got the speed and the specific shape that I wanted. I found in my case that a little 2-stage was doing what I wanted. I think at some point I experimented with a 3-stage. So, you know, it's out there. You just get a shape that sounds like the way you want it to sound. I also got a little fancy and added in an LFO that has very little depth. This kept the note from settling, and this was sort of my makeshift solution to trying to keep the note sounding close, because the depth of the LFO makes it so that the pitch goes up and down very little, but it doesn't quite stay on the note, but it still sounds like it's that note. And this is how I accomplished sort of the unsettledness that I went for in my sound. Maybe I could be more severe here. You can hold down Alt, I believe it's Alt, and scroll wheel, and that will allow you to zoom in and out on the envelope page so you can manipulate the points on your envelope at a much smaller scale. And you'll hold Alt and click and drag in order to move the point around without snapping to the grid if you've got snap enabled, which is something I leave enabled, and I always use Alt to move off the grid. The next thing I want to tackle now to get myself into that space is the filter and the verb. And I also want to slap some chorus on there because it definitely sounds like it. I also experimented with unison, but decided it was not producing what I wanted. So I'm not going to talk about unison, but I did try it. It just didn't sound right. So in Citrus, I can route just through the effects channel and get nearly all the verb, filter, and chorus in just a couple knob moves. So I route operator 1 to filter 1, and then take only the effects out of filter 1. So now I'm going through a filter, and I'm going through the effects, and on the effects there's already a chorus applied. And I also turn off the direct out of operator 1. And if you've never worked with FM synthesis, it can seem a little daunting, like understanding where all the knobs go, but it's really straightforward. You just select the first knob in the first column for filter 1, and that's going to correlate to operator 1. So each of the vertical columns is basically the operator, and then horizontally is basically where you're sending it. So it's pretty simple, but at the same time, it's not if you're not used to thinking of routing and stuff. So, but anyways, just copy what's on my screen if you're still lost. Citrus has a variable state filter on by default, and that's actually the one I wanted. It's kind of like an EQ and a filter at the same time, which is really nice. The sound is also going through that chorus I mentioned in the effects channel. So there's a filter tab, and we're going through filter 1, and there's also an effects tab. Now there's only one effects tab, so if once you click on the effects, if you have any operator going through an effect, it'll show up under those effects. So if you make a change there and you have multiple things going on, it's all changed by the same amount of effects, which is one reason you might choose to go direct out and try and do things in post or something. So we're going to go over to the effects tab, which is where the chorus is. And you'll notice that a chorus is already on by default. I didn't hear any distracting phasing in the original signal. And so what that means in chorusing is that either the depth is pretty low or the speed is pretty low. And also the number of voices you have active will affect this. So I kept the number of voices to 2 because more than that would create a different effect than what I wanted. The phasing would be a lot more audible. I also brought the depth up to a little over halfway, and I actually brought the speed down because I wanted, that's just after some experimenting. This is just what I thought sounded best. So it's not like an exact science here. I'm just trying to get that sort of sound that I was hearing before, and a chorus seemed to be doing me good. So that's what I stuck with. So now we can move over to the reverb. In Citrus, the reverb is off by default. So I turned that on, and I brought the decay up to 6 seconds, which is really long. And at least for most sounds, that's pretty dang long. Some of you may choose to use a post verb, but I wanted to stay inside of Citrus and not deal with additional plugins outside, at least as much as possible. So now we've got a big, long, echoey reverb, and this verb actually does go through the distortions, which is something that I added after I'd already done all this. I probably wouldn't have done it in this order, which is one of the benefits of just being creative, you know, like, hey, what if the verb sounds cool? And the verb actually became an important element in the distortion. Distortion is like a funny thing. It doesn't always sound, there's a lot of different kinds. So when I say distortion, you got to sort of listen with an open mind. It can mean a lot of things, sonically speaking, that is. For what it's worth, I also checked the tempo sync button here. I don't think it's making a massive impact, but maybe there's some. I don't hear anything that's really noteworthy, but I did check it. So that took care of the effects panel, at least everything I wanted to mess with in there. So now we're going to move on over to the filter. Now the filter was a tricky call. It's by far the thing I spent the most time messing with. I automated the cutoff of the filter with an envelope because, again, it sounded like a sound that was consistent with every note press. At this time, I also automated the volume of operator 1 with an envelope. And the reason for this one is because I'm focusing specifically on the shape of this sound at this point. So that's where my attention is sort of at. After a while, I decided to create a 2-step envelope for the volume. And the reason I went for volume before the filter was because as I was listening to the sound, it definitely sounded like there might have been a sustain, but for the most part, in the sections that I listened to anyways, it was always about the same length. So I thought I'll use the volume to nail the shape of the sound. And it's sort of like if you were like to be making a statue, you're chiseling away at the general form of your statue, and then I was going to use the filter to get in like the details of the statue. So that was the idea. So the general shape of the sound, and then the filter will sort of define what that shape should sound like. But this got a little convoluted as I went because I actually ended up activating another volume envelope. So let's go ahead. First, I set up this first one. And I'm looking at the sound, and I decided a 2-stage envelope is what I'm looking for. And I settled on this shape, which is a shape I completely settled on by ear and just experimenting in a bunch of different stuff. So I'm just showing you what I came up with. Maybe you would conclude something different. The second volume envelope I added was actually on the filter page. And this one looks very similar to the default envelope. I was just sort of messing with things, and so that's how that one came to be. And it's kind of interesting what happens when you put them together. You get a very different kind of sound. as far as the attack goes, the shape is pretty changed. And so I left it there because it was doing me favors. So it was one of those things where, hey, it just sort of worked out. I wasn't being the most specific about what I was going for. It was at this point that I added the actual filter envelope, and I added it for the cutoff. I listened to the sample and came up with an envelope that I thought would match it again. So we need to talk about how the envelope works though, because we're using a variable state filter. So the center of the envelope is the cutoff frequency, with below the center causing the cutoff value to go down and above the center causing the cutoff value to go up. And so we can actually turn our filter on and off around this center value. So after setting this up, I had to wonder, what level should each slider be at? And I spent the longest time with just the low end. I completely removed the band and the high, and it just wasn't accomplishing what I wanted. So actually, I ended up turning these back up to eventually the positions you see them at now. And this is just where really tricky stuff sets in, because at this point, we have enough stuff in place that if we change things, it can mean a bunch of things. So as your sound changes, it could be, oh, I changed this, a couple minutes ago, and that could possibly be related to this. And you just get into this huge chain of, oh, what caused this and what caused that. It can be very confusing. So this is where the experimenting and sort of trying out and fine-tuning settings sort of comes into play. I thought the high end was too bright, and so I took it out at first, but after a bunch of experimenting, I realized I needed it, and I was tripping. But moving the high end on the filter slider wasn't quite the right sound, especially with the filter moving the way I wanted. It just wasn't sounding right. So I put the high and mids into the level that I thought was needed, but then I went to the global page, and on the global page, there is an EQ. And so I simply just brought down the high end on the EQ there until it was what I was hearing for. And that's pretty much how I came up with those. Now at this point, my sound wasn't all there. I had a sound, but it wasn't the sound, or at least it wasn't close enough for me to be, particularly happy with what was going on. So I was dissatisfied, trying out all sorts of things. This is when distortion finally occurred to me. I was like, hey, what if I try out distortion? Because distortion can go some really wonky ways. When I think of distortion, I tend to think of those crazy overdriven guitar sounds, but distortion can actually offer a lot more to your sonic palette. There are hundreds upon thousands of different distortion sounds that sound totally different from each other. And it ended up being a really good thing. So I'm going to have to apologize at this point because the distortions I used are not FL distortions. I reached for Trash 2 by Isotope, and I also reached for Driver by Native Instruments. Why? Why did I reach for these? And why did I reach for two of them? Because at first you'd be like, whoa, I wouldn't think to go for two, I'd go for one. Well, again, I tried stuff with just one, and it was not going that well. I tried stuff with just Driver, and decided that a gentle stage of distortion before hitting Driver would sound a lot better than just Driver in the signal chain. So it's sort of like your pregame, you get pumped up in one, but you get pumped up a little bit differently. And then when you go out on the field, that's when you go hard. And so that's sort of my idea here. I'm going to go through the first distortion, get pumped up, and the second distortion is going to provide the rest of that oomph And the two stages, you know, the two different algorithmic processes are going to yield different sounds. So that was because just with the experimenting with one, I was like, hey, it'd probably benefit from this. Now, as to why I selected each plug, well, one of the reasons is Trash 2 has a convolution engine that I'm a fan of, and the distortions offered by FL, don't get me wrong, they're really good, but I just knew that the sounds I was looking for in this case would be more easily produced by the other two that I mentioned, Trash 2 and Driver. So that's the reason I went for those. So I'm sorry if FL had something that would be easier to work with in that category, but working with the Wave Shaper, it's just gonna get tricky. So I just was like, you know, I'm just gonna go for this. And they're great at non-linear. Now, Trash 2 is basically like two fruity wave shapers in a convolution, but to set that up is just a lot more work. So anyways, again, I'm sorry, but that's some of the reasons why I chose those. It was one of those things where I'm just calling it out based on experience. The impact the distortion has is massive. It can completely change your sound. I settled on 2 presets, which makes it easy to replicate if you have these plugs, and I was done. Or at least that was as much time as I was willing to spend on this particular project. Close enough in my book, and I had a number of other possible sounds that I could use now. So at this point, I'm pretty satisfied with what's going on. So that's how I made this sound, and the thought process and the methods that I used. I skipped a bunch of things actually that just didn't work, such as post EQs. You might have seen one in this video if I didn't remove it, which turned out to just be a bad idea because it was a static thing, so it wasn't moving. If it was a moving EQ, it might have worked out better, but in my case, I left it where it was. Hopefully you picked up on some new tricks and concepts and saw some different ways to look at things. Support me on Patreon and subscribe. I'll probably have this patch up for download in the description, or the project or something will be down there so that you too can enjoy this wonderful patch and have a blessed day.